In the year 1598, a dying warlord lay in his castle bed. He had risen from nothing, the son of a peasant farmer who could not even afford a sword. And yet, by the end of his life, he had conquered all of Japan. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. As he drew his final breaths, surrounded by his closest advisors, he asked them to make one last promise: to protect his 5-year-old son, to preserve his legacy, to keep Japan unified after he was gone. The advisors swore the oath. Within 2 years, all of them would betray it, and the bloodiest battle in Japanese history would decide the fate of an entire nation. This is the story of the Sengoku Era, the age of warring states. For 100 years, Japan tore itself apart. Province against province, brother against brother, master against servant. It was the longest, bloodiest, most violent century in Japanese history. But it was also the age that gave birth to the most legendary warriors the world has ever seen: the samurai. 3 men would rise from this chaos to change Japan forever. A ruthless tyrant who would burn temples and slaughter monks to crush the old order. A peasant who would become the most powerful man in the country. And a patient general who would wait and scheme and outlive them all. This is the complete history of the Sengoku Era, the bloodiest century in the history of Japan. To understand the bloodiest century in Japan's history, we must first understand how it began. For over 400 years, Japan had been ruled by a single emperor in the ancient capital of Kyoto. He sat upon the chrysanthemum throne, considered to be a living god, descended directly from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. But by the year 1100 AD, real power no longer rested with the emperor. The emperor had become a figurehead, a symbol, a puppet kept hidden away in his palace, while real decisions were made by a new class of men, the warrior class, the samurai. The word samurai comes from an old Japanese verb meaning to serve. In the early centuries, these men were nothing more than armed servants, hired by powerful noble families to protect their lands, to collect their taxes, to enforce their will. But over time, the servants became the masters. The samurai learned to fight on horseback. They mastered the bow and the curved sword called the katana. They developed a strict code of honor, of loyalty, of discipline that would later be known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. By the late 12th century, the most powerful samurai families had risen high enough to seize control of the entire country. A new title was created: Shogun, military dictator, supreme commander of all the warriors of Japan. The emperor remained in his palace, performing ancient rituals, while the shogun ruled the actual country from a new capital of his own. For 300 years, this system worked. The shogun controlled the samurai controlled the people. The emperor performed the ceremonies, and Japan, by and large, was at peace. But in the year 1467, that peace shattered. A dispute over who should be the next shogun erupted between 2 powerful samurai families. The dispute turned into open war on the streets of Kyoto itself. For 10 years, the 2 sides fought through the capital, burning palaces, destroying temples, and reducing one of the most beautiful cities in the world to ash. It was called the Onin War, and when it finally ended, the central government of Japan had effectively collapsed. The shogun's authority was gone, the emperor was powerless, and across the country, hundreds of local samurai lords realized something incredible. There was no one left to stop them. These local lords called themselves daimyo, great names. They each commanded their own private armies, they each ruled their own provinces, they each built their own castles. And now, without any central authority to hold them in check, they began to do what warriors do. They began to fight each other. For territory, for wealth, for glory, for survival. What followed was 100 years of constant, brutal, unending warfare across the entire country of Japan. It was a time when no one was safe, when the only law was the law of the sword. When a peasant could rise to become a warlord, and a warlord could be cut down by his own brother by morning. The Japanese themselves had a name for this terrifying new world: Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. And in the chaos and bloodshed of this century, 3 men would rise to power. 3 men who would change Japanese history forever. The first of them was about to be born. In the year 1534, in a small province called Owari, a son was born to a minor samurai warlord. The child was named Oda Nobunaga. He was not destined for greatness. His clan was small. His territory was minor. There were dozens of more powerful warlords across Japan who had better claims to power, better armies, and better strategists than the Oda family ever could. But Nobunaga, even as a young man, was different from everyone around him. He dressed in strange clothes. He behaved erratically. He laughed at sacred traditions. He insulted important nobles. He gathered around himself a group of misfits, outcasts, and rough men whom no one else would take seriously. His own family began to call him the Fool of Owari. But the fool was paying attention. While his rivals fought each other in honorable, traditional samurai battles, Nobunaga was studying something new, something dangerous. A weapon that had arrived in Japan from Portuguese traders just 20 years before. The matchlock musket. Most samurai considered firearms beneath them, dishonorable, not the way of a true warrior. But Nobunaga saw something different. He saw the future. In 1560, when he was just 26 years old, Nobunaga faced his first great test. A massive army of 25,000 warriors, led by the powerful warlord Imagawa Yoshimoto, invaded his small territory. Nobunaga had only 3,000 men. The odds were impossible. His advisors begged him to surrender. Nobunaga refused. Instead, he led his 3,000 warriors in a surprise attack during a thunderstorm. Catching Imagawa's army resting in a narrow valley, Nobunaga's men struck like lightning. The enemy commander Imagawa was killed in the chaos. His massive army collapsed. It was called the Battle of Okehazama, and it was the moment that announced to all of Japan that the Fool of Owari was no fool at all. In the next 20 years, Nobunaga conquered everyone in his path. He took the great city of Kyoto and made himself the real power behind the emperor. He destroyed his rival warlords one by one. He built a magnificent castle at Azuchi, with 7 floors and walls covered in gold leaf, that became the most beautiful structure in all of Japan. But Nobunaga was not just a brilliant general. He was also ruthless. He had no patience for the powerful warrior monks who had defied central authority for centuries. When the Buddhist monks of Mount Hiei resisted his rule, Nobunaga ordered the entire mountain monastery burned to the ground. 20,000 monks, women, and children were killed in a single day. When the warrior monks of the Ishiyama Hongan fortress held out against him for 10 years, he eventually starved them into submission and razed their stronghold. He earned a new name from his enemies, the Demon King of the Sixth Heaven. By the year 1582, Nobunaga had conquered about half of Japan. He was the most powerful man in the country, and he was just one campaign away from unifying the entire nation under his rule. He stopped to rest at the Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with only a small bodyguard, preparing for his final march to victory. That night, one of his most trusted generals, a man named Akechi Mitsuhide, betrayed him. Mitsuhide led an army of 13,000 warriors to surround the temple in the dead of night. Nobunaga awoke to find himself trapped, with only a few dozen samurai to defend him. He fought bravely, but there was no escape. Refusing to be captured by a traitor, Nobunaga set fire to the temple himself and committed seppuku, ritual suicide, in the flames. He was 49 years old. The Demon King was dead. But the unification of Japan that he had begun would not die with him. Because in his army, there was a man waiting for his moment. A peasant who had risen further than any peasant in Japanese history had ever risen. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he was about to finish what his master had begun. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was born in 1537, the son of a poor peasant farmer in Owari Province. He had no family name, no samurai lineage, no claim to nobility of any kind. In the rigid caste system of feudal Japan, he should have died as he was born, a nameless peasant working in the rice paddies of his ancestors. He was small in stature. Some said he looked like a monkey. He was never going to be a great warrior. He was never going to win his fortune through skill with the sword. But Hideyoshi had something else. He was the most cunning, intelligent, and tireless man of his entire generation. As a young man, he ran away from home and offered himself as a servant to the rising warlord Oda Nobunaga. At first, he was given the most humble jobs imaginable, carrying Nobunaga's sandals, cleaning the stables, polishing the swords of his betters. But Hideyoshi worked harder than anyone else. He thought faster than anyone else. He observed everything. He listened. He learned. And slowly, Nobunaga began to notice. By the time Nobunaga had conquered half of Japan, Hideyoshi was no longer a sandal carrier. He had become one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals, commanding his own armies, winning his own battles, earning the respect of samurai who had been born into noble families for 10 generations. And then, in 1582, Nobunaga was betrayed at the Honnoji Temple. While other generals scrambled in confusion, Hideyoshi acted with breathtaking speed. He was hundreds of miles away, fighting another campaign when he heard the news. Within hours, he had negotiated a peace treaty with his current enemy. Within days, he had marched his army back across Japan at a pace that no army had ever matched before. And within 2 weeks, he had personally hunted down and killed the traitor Akechi Mitsuhide. He had avenged his master. And in doing so, he had positioned himself as the natural successor to Nobunaga's empire. The peasant had become the most powerful man in Japan. Over the next 8 years, Hideyoshi finished what Nobunaga had started. He conquered the western provinces. He brought the southern lords to their knees. He invaded the northern territories. By 1590, after nearly a century of warfare, Hideyoshi had achieved what no one had been able to do. Japan was unified for the first time in over 100 years. But Hideyoshi could not become shogun, because the title of shogun required noble blood, and Hideyoshi was still, at his core, a peasant. So he created a new title for himself, Taiko, retired regent, a position invented just for him that gave him absolute power without requiring noble birth. Hideyoshi lived in extraordinary luxury in his magnificent new castle at Osaka. He hosted tea ceremonies that were attended by the most powerful men in the country. He built temples. He patronized artists. He surrounded himself with beauty and refinement that no peasant had ever dreamed of touching. But he was not satisfied. In 1592, in an act of incredible arrogance, Hideyoshi launched an invasion of Korea. He intended to conquer Korea, then march into China and become the master of all of East Asia. The Korean campaign was a disaster. For 7 years, Japanese armies bled in Korea. Tens of thousands of samurai died fighting an enemy that simply would not surrender. Hideyoshi's grand ambitions collapsed into stalemate and embarrassment. By the year 1598, Hideyoshi was 61 years old, exhausted and dying. He had achieved more than any peasant in Japanese history. He had ruled the entire country. He had created a new title. He had built an empire of luxury. But he had one final wish. He had a 5-year-old son named Hideyori, and as Hideyoshi lay on his deathbed, he begged his most trusted generals to protect this boy, to preserve his family's rule, to keep Japan unified after he was gone. 5 generals swore the oath. The most powerful of them all was a patient, calculating man who had served both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi without ever quite revealing his own true ambitions. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu. And the moment Hideyoshi closed his eyes for the final time, Ieyasu began to break his promise. Tokugawa Ieyasu was born in 1543 into a minor samurai family caught between 2 powerful warring neighbors. His childhood was defined by one thing above all else: captivity. When he was just 6 years old, Ieyasu was taken from his family and held as a political hostage, first by one powerful clan, then by another. For nearly 12 years, the young boy lived as a prisoner, a bargaining chip used by greater men in their endless games of power. Most children would have been broken by this, but Ieyasu learned something during those long years of captivity that would define the rest of his life. He learned patience. He learned to watch, to wait, to never reveal his true thoughts, to survive by being useful, by being quiet, and by never, ever acting until the perfect moment had arrived. When he was finally freed as a young man, Ieyasu became a vassal, first to Nobunaga and then to Hideyoshi. For decades, he served them loyally. He fought their battles. He expanded their territories. He never rebelled. He never overreached. He simply built his strength year after year and waited. By the time Hideyoshi lay dying in 1598, Ieyasu had become the single most powerful lord in all of Japan. He commanded the largest army. He controlled the richest lands, centered around a small fishing village in eastern Japan called Edo, which would one day grow into the city we now call Tokyo. And when Hideyoshi begged him to protect his young son, Ieyasu swore the oath along with the 4 other regents. But Ieyasu had been waiting his entire life for this moment. He was now 55 years old. He had spent his childhood as a hostage, his adulthood as a loyal servant, and his entire life as the most patient man in Japan. He was not about to let the ultimate prize slip through his fingers now. In the months after Hideyoshi's death, Ieyasu began to move, carefully, subtly. He formed secret alliances with other lords. He arranged strategic marriages between powerful families. He slowly, methodically gathered power to himself, all while publicly claiming that he was only acting to protect Hideyoshi's young heir. The other regents saw exactly what he was doing, and Japan began to split into two great factions. On one side stood Ieyasu and his eastern allies. On the other side stood the lords loyal to the Toyotomi family, led by a brilliant and determined administrator named Ishida Mitsunari. For 2 years the tension built. Both sides gathered their forces. Both sides called in their allies. Both sides knew that the future of all Japan would soon be decided. Not through politics, not through marriage, not through patient maneuvering, but through one final, massive, decisive battle. A battle that would bring together over 150,000 samurai warriors on a single misty field. A battle that would end the age of warring states forever. A battle whose name still echoes through Japanese history. Sekigahara, the greatest samurai battle ever fought. And it was about to begin. On the morning of October the 21st, in the year 1600, a thick fog covered a narrow valley in central Japan. The valley was called Sekigahara, and on that misty morning, more than 150,000 samurai warriors stood ready to decide the fate of an entire nation. On the western side stood the army loyal to the Toyotomi family, commanded by Ishida Mitsunari, 80,000 men. They held the high ground. They had the superior position. By every measure of military strategy, they should have won. On the eastern side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu and his allies, 75,000 men, fighting on lower ground in a weaker position against a well-prepared enemy. But Ieyasu had a weapon that Mitsunari did not: betrayal. In the weeks before the battle, the patient Ieyasu had been doing what he did best: working in secret, sending quiet messages, making private promises to the lords on the western side, convincing several of Mitsunari's most important commanders to switch sides at the critical moment. When the fog finally lifted that morning, the battle began. For hours, the two armies smashed into each other with terrible force. Tens of thousands of samurai clashed across the muddy valley. Muskets roared. Arrows filled the sky. Banners fell and rose again. Neither side could gain the upper hand. Mitsunari's plan was working. His forces on the high ground held firm. His allies were positioned perfectly to crush the Eastern army from the flanks. There was just one problem. Some of those allies had already secretly agreed to betray him. On a mountain overlooking the battlefield sat a young lord named Kobayakawa Hideaki, commanding 15,000 fresh troops. He was supposed to be fighting for the Western army. Mitsunari was counting on him to charge down the mountain and shatter Ieyasu's exhausted forces. But Kobayakawa hesitated. He had made a secret promise to Ieyasu. But now, at the critical moment, with the battle raging below him, he could not decide which side to choose. For hours, he simply watched, frozen with indecision, while both armies bled and died in the valley below. Ieyasu grew impatient. In a moment of pure audacity, he ordered his own gunners to fire directly at Kobayakawa's position on the mountain. A message delivered through musket fire: choose now. And it worked. Terrified and forced into a decision, Kobayakawa ordered his 15,000 fresh troops to charge down the mountain and slammed them directly into the flank of his own Western allies. It was the turning point of the battle. The Western army, betrayed from within, collapsed into chaos. Other lords who had made secret deals with Ieyasu switched sides as well. The perfect position that Mitsunari had built crumbled in a matter of hours. By the end of the day, the Western army was destroyed. Ishida Mitsunari fled, but was captured a few days later and executed. The Battle of Sekigahara was over. In a single day, the fate of Japan had been decided. Tokugawa Ieyasu was now, without question, the most powerful man in the entire country. 3 years later, in 1603, Ieyasu finally claimed the prize he had waited his entire life for. The emperor granted him the ancient title that Hideyoshi the Peasant had never been able to hold: Shogun. Ieyasu established his government in his eastern capital of Edo. He created a system so stable, so carefully balanced, so absolute, that it would keep Japan at peace for the next 250 years. The Tokugawa Shogunate. The patient hostage who had waited his entire life had finally won. And the age of warring states, the Sengoku Jidai, the bloodiest century in Japanese history, had finally, after 130 years, come to an end. For 130 years, Japan had been a land of constant war. 3 men ended it. Nobunaga, the ruthless innovator who shattered the old world. Hideyoshi, the peasant genius who unified the broken pieces. And Ieyasu, the patient schemer who built a peace that would last for 2.5 centuries. There is an old Japanese saying that captures their story perfectly. Nobunaga pounded the rice, Hideyoshi shaped the cake, and Ieyasu sat down and ate it. But the most remarkable part of the story came after the wars had ended. Under the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai slowly transformed. The warriors who had once spent their lives fighting and dying on the battlefield now had no more wars to fight. And so, they became something new. They became scholars, administrators, poets, philosophers. The code of the warrior, Bushido, evolved from a set of battlefield rules into a profound philosophy of honor, discipline, and self-mastery that would shape Japanese culture forever. The sword, once a tool of war, became a symbol of the soul. For 250 years, Japan remained at peace, isolated from the world, frozen in time. The samurai class endured, passing their traditions from generation to generation, long after the battles that created them had faded into memory. And then, in the 1860s, the modern world finally arrived. Western ships appeared on the horizon. The age of guns and steam and industry had come. And the way of the samurai, the way that had endured for nearly 700 years, came to an end at last. The swords were put away, the top knots were cut, the warrior class was abolished. But the spirit of the samurai never truly died. It lives on today in the martial arts practiced around the world, in the principles of honor and discipline that still define Japanese culture, in the countless films, books, and stories that continue to be inspired by these legendary warriors. The samurai were more than just soldiers. They were a reflection of a profound idea: that a human being could master themselves completely, that discipline could be a form of beauty, that honor could be worth more than life itself. The age of the samurai is gone, but their legend is eternal. This was the story of the Sengoku Era, the bloodiest century in the history of Japan. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Aether Stories for more deep dives into the civilizations that shaped our world. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story. Thank you for watching. Until next time.